Motion be agreed to.
Speaker.
Dr Megan Woods.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise to give a speech on this piece of legislation. It is important legislation and Labor is happy to support this bill. I'd like to acknowledge the work of the member that has just taken her seat, the Honourable Nikki Wagner, in sponsoring this bill as a local bill. I'd also like to acknowledge the work of the Chair of the Arts Centre Trust Board, the Honourable Margaret Austin, and the work that she has done to save this set of buildings. I think after both the September and the February quakes, most Cantabrians, after their questioning whether their family and their friends were safe, their thoughts turned to what had happened to the Arts Centre buildings and whether or not they were a set of buildings that had survived the quakes. Because for Cantabrians and Christchurch people, as the previous speaker has just said, there is a deeply personal connection to this site. This was a site that was gifted to the city in 1973. Well, the announcement was made in 1973, the year that I was born, and I feel a personal connection with this site. Growing up in Christchurch in the 1980s, everything happened on this site. It was the place of the Ducks Deluxe, the place where everyone gathered to have a drink. It was a place where there was a market on the weekend, where there were no other markets in Christchurch. It was the place where I received my first pamphlet about New Zealand becoming nuclear free as a young teenager in Christchurch. It was the place of the Court Theatre. It was the place of the Southern Ballet. And it was the place of Le Cafe. This was a place where memories were made in Christchurch, and it means so much to the people of Christchurch that we can save it and that we can have this legislation that enters into the statute books, the original trust deed, and that will ensure that this set of buildings do endure. But Mr Speaker, the Arts Centre buildings and the trust deed being entered into legislation has personal significance for me. It was one of the predecessors in my seat, and a predecessor I share with the Honourable Ruth Dyson, the Right Honourable Norman Kirk, who announced the decision that the university at its centennial convocation was going to gift, it is said, the buildings on the Arts Centre site to the city of Christchurch to be used as a cultural centre. But Mr Speaker, according to Kirk family folklore, and I spoke to members of the Kirk family today, that actually it was a deal done for $1, because the university couldn't simply gift that land to the city, that it needed to be sold to the city. And I'm informed by the son of the Right Honourable Norman Kirk, Bob Kirk, who went on to become a Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the University of Canterbury, that often the university administration, when talk of the university moving back into the city was raised, would talk about just collecting the interest on that payment as payment for moving back onto the site. So, Mr Speaker, for Norm Kirk, there was a huge significance in this set of buildings being gifted to the city of Christchurch and becoming a cultural and educational centre for the city. When he announced it, he said it was a great gift to the city, the province and the nation. And he expressed his hope that the bodies would use the buildings to draw the threads of all the cultures of New Zealand and attempt to produce something uniquely New Zealand in character. And I'd like to acknowledge the former member for Sydenham and the work that he did in making sure that we had this unique set of buildings standing in the centre of our city, and a set of buildings that we can rebuild our city around. Because Norman Kirk saw culture as vitally important to New Zealanders and the world in which they were living. Defending the appropriateness of a politician addressing a cultural conference in that same year, 1973, Norman Kirk's politics, he said, is the conscious projection of a country's identity. The culture is that identity and not something removed or remote from everyday life. and I'd like us to reflect on those words that are as true today in 2015 as they were when Norman Kirk said it in 1973. He said that he saw the arts as having a very important part to play in our desire to foster regional cooperation. And again, I would like to endorse those words and say that they have as much to offer us today as they did when Norman Kirk said them. At the Centennial Convocation, where Norman Kirk made the announcement that the Arts Centre was being gifted to the city of Christchurch, it was the brainchild of Professor Neville Phillips from the University of Canterbury. And as a PhD graduate from the History Department at the University of Canterbury, I would like to acknowledge one of the greatest professors of history from that department and the contribution that they have made to the cultural life of Christchurch and the foresight that people like Neville Phillips and Norman Kirk had for the value of these buildings to the city of Christchurch, because Neville Phillips certainly saw that. The gifting of a set of buildings this unique and this special spawned the need for special rules to be made. And the Arts Centre, for those interested in issues of planning and zoning and perhaps even resource management in today's context, might like to reflect that this was the first cultural zone that New Zealand had for this set of buildings, because it was a special part of town planning that was needed to ensure that the heritage fabric of these buildings stayed intact and did not come under any threat. And Mr Speaker, we in Labour hope that by enshrining the trust deed into legislation, as we are with this local bill, that we are protecting the heritage value and the very rich heritage, both social and physical, that these buildings offer to the city of Christchurch. We want to be sure that these buildings do stay. The Minister in her speech did address whether or not stone buildings would cover the whole site. Well, I think I speak for generations of not just Christchurch people, but generations of people around the country who have fond memories of times at the Ducks Deluxe or the Student Union if they were a student at the university when it was on the town site, and would like to think that this building will survive the wrecking ball of Christchurch's rebuild as well. This is a special building to our character and something that needs to be preserved. The departmental report that the Select Committee got back made it clear that the purpose of the legislation was to enshrine the original purposes of the trust deed, which did only refer to stone buildings. But I would like to place on the record, and I'd like to implore everybody involved in that decision, that it needs to be more than that, because the precinct of the Arts Centre encompasses more than that to us as Christchurch people. We're told that it would need special consent as a Group 3 building in the Christchurch district plan to be demolished. But Christchurch people and Cantabrians are only too aware of Section 38 of the SERA legislation that bypasses many of the protections we've had for our heritage buildings. We've had 1,240 demolitions within the 4 avenues in Christchurch, an area that falls under central government control. Compare that with the 292 rebuild consents that have been granted in the same space. Of those 1,240 demolitions, Mr Speaker, 20% of those buildings have been heritage buildings. And we would, on this side of the House, would like to make it strongly known that we have a desire to see the heritage fabric of our city retained, because our rebuilt city and our recovered city needs to value its past. It needs to value the words that Norman Kirk spoke in 1973 when he talked about drawing the threads of all the cultures of our city together to show something truly unique about our city and our nation. I'd like to honour the people that have fought for the retention of this site in the past, and to thank those of today who have ensured it will last for many more years to come, Mr Speaker.
Scott Simpson.
Thank you, Mr